Afternoon, everyone. My name is Iram Ditter, and I'm the IRMS Legal Group Chair. Thank you for joining today's IRMS Legal session on the topic of retention and in-place records management in Microsoft 365. This session is going to be recorded and will be available on the IRMS YouTube channel after the session. It's the second in a series of the Microsoft 365 sessions, and our next session will take place on the 20th of October, and that will soon be open for registration. It will be on the topic of classifying and controlling data in Teams with sensitivity labels in Microsoft 365 to help prevent the wild west of Teams. I'm now going to turn you over to our lovely speaker, Sarah Fenner, who is a Microsoft 365 trainer and consultant with Leadership Through Data. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a good day so far. I hope the sound behaves and you can't hear the digger that has just decided to start up outside my house. Don't you just love roadworks? Anyway, today's topic is retention and records management in Microsoft 365. And as you heard, my name's Sarah Fenner. I apologise for this really busy slide. It's probably the worst slide in the deck, so hopefully you'll forgive me. Do look me up on social media if you want to know more about my background, but I love collecting the Microsoft certifications. I currently hold 50, so hopefully I'm an expert in the field as by now anyway. Okay, so in the previous session, we looked at what Microsoft 365 offered in the way of governance tools. We looked at governing information, we looked at managing retention, carrying out investigations, and managing privacy risk. We're going to dive deeper into the manage retention space here today. And we've got 3 topics. So we're going to use the retention management tools and the records management tools to allow us to keep the data we want to keep hold of, basically preventing our users from deleting content either too early or at all. But we also use the retention and records management tools to ensure that we get rid of content that we don't need. Okay, and this may be that we want to keep our Teams chats for a year, but after they get to a year old, they're no longer viable, they're no longer valuable, so we get rid of them. Okay, and it depends on the organization that you work in, how they want to handle the different components. So there are no defaults, okay, in terms of retention and records management configured in Microsoft 365. So it's fully up to you. Okay. The other thing we can then do is we can look at preserving the content as it is. And this is where the records management functionality comes into play. Okay. And I will be highlighting licensing requirements as we go through this presentation. I talk about different features, but the records management functionality is actually the E5 licensing level. Okay, so it's the premium licensing features, and that's what we use to preserve the content as it is. So in Microsoft 365 terms, when we mark content as a record, we keep the information in its current state, not just prevent deleting it. Okay. And we've just got a comment in the chat about the video. Is it working? Is it working for anyone? Okay.
Yeah, we can all see you just fine.
Okay, so those of you who are having any issues with the connection, please try reconnecting to the session. Okay, so we're also going to look first of all, a couple of definitions. So we're going to be looking at retention, but Microsoft 365 also includes the eDiscovery holds option. Okay, so eDiscovery holds is a feature that we can set up, switch on to prevent users deleting content, mainly from mailboxes. Okay, it is quite a high level of admin overhead because you're having to set it up per user, per mailbox, and it can be quite a blunt instrument in terms of maintaining all of the content that users generate. Okay. When we look at retention, this gives us a more long-term approach. It gives us also a way that we can focus our attention in a little bit more detail. We can either make it broad or we can make it specific to individual pieces of content. Okay, so based on what is in the content, we can set different retention. We can configure a start and an end date. We can manage a deletion process, a disposal process, although disposition review is an E5 feature. And once it's set up, it's a very, very low overhead. Okay, so that means that once it's configured, we can leave it to run and we can use the configuration to ensure that it picks up new users, new SharePoint sites, new teams automatically. Now, if you attended the previous session, you will have seen this slide already. So these are all of the records and retention management features inside Microsoft 365. So we have the retention of content or the deletion. We're going to look in a bit more detail as to how we manage that. The in-place records management is the type of records management that we use in Microsoft 365 because we don't move the content somewhere else. We just retain it where it was generated and protect it against updates there. So we've got the disposition reviews. We also have the ability to edit records. And this is quite an interesting one. If a piece of content is a record, then you shouldn't be editing it. But what happens if the content needs to be updated, but you still need to keep that previous state? And that's when we would unlock a record, make the edits, and then lock it again and have the advantage of the version history to see the changes between the documents, but the two versions that are records will then be maintained. And there's an interesting new feature that's come out in the last couple of weeks with regard, or been announced in the last couple of weeks with regard to locking and unlocking records, in that we can actually set up content from the minute it's created to be a record, but not switch on the locking until such time as it's finished. And that means we can actually attach those labels to our templates as well. So that gives us a bit more control there as well. So it's a slight change in functionality, but really helpful. Regulatory records are very, very precise in that once a regulatory record label is applied to a piece of content, no one can remove that label, not even your administrators, not even a service desk call to Microsoft, nothing. That label cannot be removed. The content cannot be unlocked. It is exactly preserved as it is, and you cannot change the label at all on that record. So some very strong protections in the regulatory records, so to be used with extreme caution. I'm talking about labels here, and we'll go into a bit more detail and see how we can apply retention. But we have the option to apply labels manually by users making a decision, or to apply labels automatically. Now, the automatic application of labels is an E5 functionality. It does require the premium licenses, but that can be based on information within the document, the type of document it is, and can also extend into your Teams chats and your emails, as well as the documentation stored in Microsoft 365. Event-driven retention is also a premium feature, and that allows us to track the content and apply the record label from a specific event date, such as the end of a financial year, or the closing off of a case, or the starting up of a case, depending on what your features want to be. Okay. We also have location defaults, and this is where we apply what we call retention policies, and the policies are the default for an environment, so Teams chat, email, etc. Okay. Again, a new feature that's just starting to roll out is the ability to apply default sensitivity labels to folders. We've always had, for a very long time, the ability to apply a retention label as the default. But we can also use those two features together. Okay, so we can use retention labels as a trigger for a sensitivity label and vice versa. Okay. I notice there's a couple of questions in the chat. So before I go much further, I'm going to pull over to those actually on the questions tab. The first one is that we can edit and see different versions. Okay. The record is maintained exactly as it is. So it will be modified. So the new version will be modified, but the existing version will not be edited. Okay, so nothing on the version that we've marked as a record will be changed. Okay, so we can see the different versions, but the checksum of the record will not be edited, because the updated version will become a different record. Okay, so hopefully that answers that question. Moving on to the next one, if we apply records management policies through an E5 license, this is the conundrum of a mix of licensing within an organization. Okay, so technically, according to the Microsoft licensing agreement, anyone who benefits from functionality included in an E5 license needs to have an E5 license assigned to them. So if I have an organization with a mix of licensing, I can only set up, for example, automatic labeling of content with a records label in SharePoint sites and Teams or mailboxes used by users who have an E5 license assigned to them. Okay, if you set up your records management policies, you set up your automatic labeling, etc., and users who don't have the E5 license have access to those environments, your records management features will work as you require. However, you are in breach of your licensing agreement. So it's not technically enforced, but you are not following the licensing agreement. So hopefully that clears those two questions. Okay. Moving on. Okay. When we create a record label, an administrator creates the label, the end user applies a label, and then the tools enforce the protections of the label. Okay. And this is true whether it's a retention label or a record label. Okay. The records label, the difference is that that protects the editing of the content, not just maintaining, preventing, or causing deletion. Okay. So retention is about deletion, either allowing, blocking, or triggering. And the records management functionality is about preserving the content. We have all of the retention settings in the records management side of things as well. Okay. When we create a retention policy, then what we're doing is setting the default for a location. For example, all SharePoint sites, all user mailboxes, or specific user mailboxes, or specific SharePoint sites. However, there's another policy that comes into play when we're working with retention and records management, and that is a label policy. And we use the label policy to make the labels available to users or SharePoint sites or teams. Okay, so 3 things. Label contains the settings which is applied to an individual piece of content or an individual folder. Okay, and then inherited by all the content within that folder. A retention policy that sets the default for SharePoint sites, teams, and mailboxes. And a label policy that pushes the labels out and publishes them and makes them available to the users. Okay. When we apply retention, to content in SharePoint, okay, the normal process of deletion is changed. So let's follow this normal route down the bottom here. Okay, I've got a document library with content in it. Please remember, when we talk about document library, we're talking about the location we can store files in. So if we're talking about SharePoint, we're also talking about files in Teams. And it's any kind of file, not just Word documents, just to be really clear on that. So when we delete some content from the document library, it goes into the recycle bin. Now, the recycle bin for SharePoint actually keeps things for 93 days. And it consists of 2 stages. And this isn't a timed stage. This is who can see it in which recycle bin. So if I, as a user, delete a piece of content, it goes into the first stage recycle bin. And if no one does anything else, it'll sit there for 93 days, then be deleted. If, as a user, I remove it from the first stage recycle bin, I no longer see it in the recycle bin, but the administrator for the site will see it in the second stage recycle bin for the remainder of that 93 days from when it was originally deleted. Okay. After those 93 days, it's permanently deleted. It's not recoverable from Microsoft 365 at all. Okay. But if you've got a backup, you've obviously got those options. No backup solution natively in Microsoft 365, as I'm sure you've all come across. Okay. If we apply a retention policy or label to a piece of content, then once a piece of content is deleted, it first of all goes into the preservation hold library. Now, the preservation hold library is a hidden library that only the administrators for the site can access. Site owner, site collection owner, or SharePoint administrator. Those are the people who have access. Those are the permissions we need. Now, at the moment, we can find the preservation hold library by going to site contents and looking for it there. But going forward, you will need to know the address of the preservation hold library. And this is because users were going in and finding it and not understanding what it was and why it was doing it. So it's becoming more hidden. Okay. That will be documented, and it will be early next year before that comes into effect. But it's a hidden library. So a user who deletes a document which is subject to a retention setting, be it the policy on the site or a label on the document, won't see it in the recycle bin because it's gone into the preservation hold library and been removed from the document library it was in. At the end of the retention period, it goes into that second stage recycle bin. It bypasses the first stage recycle bin, but it sits in that second stage recycle bin for 93 days until such time as it is permanently deleted. Now, we do have a little bit of control over that. If I just switch over into my Microsoft 365 environment, I'm in the Compliance Center, and if I go to Records Management, I can go into the Records Management settings up at the top here, and I have the option to allow users to delete documents from OneDrive or SharePoint. Now, technically, it's the same technology in the background, but we can control the settings separately for OneDrive and SharePoint, but SharePoint does include all of your Microsoft Teams teams. Okay, so if we switch this off, then the retention policy will stop the users deleting the content. It won't go into that hidden preservation hold library. It will stay exactly where it is so that the users know that it hasn't been removed. And especially as we're now going to hide that preservation hold library, it is recommended now that you switch this setting off, especially for the OneDrive, so that the users see that they can't delete the content. Okay. There is a question in the questions box about if you delete the item which is locked, yeah, then what happens with that? Well, that depends on whether you've got this records versioning switched on. That is the option that allows you to edit the record, okay, and have a version. If you don't have that switched on, then they can't create a new version of it, okay? And one of the reasons we have these deleting content for items with retention labels rather than records labels is a record you can't delete during the retention period, but you can delete something that is retained, and hence there is a discrepancy because a record label preserves it where it is, you can't delete it. A retention label, you can delete it, it goes into the preservation hold library. So this is why we have these settings here to allow us to control that behavior and make it more equitable, make it the same experience, whether it's a retention label or a record label. So just to be clear, records labels lock the content and you can't delete it during the retention period. A retention label doesn't lock the content. You can delete it during the retention period if these settings are on. Okay. And while I'm looking at the questions, we also have another one from Kathy here, going into the secret library at the end of the retention period. Okay, every SharePoint site has a library called the Preservation Hold Library if there is any content with retention in there. Okay, so a retention label or retention policy set by default on the site. The Preservation Hold Library is hidden. Okay, if I just go to SharePoint site and I go into the site contents, I see this Preservation Hold Library here. But that's because I'm an administrator of this site. If I wasn't an administrator of the site, I wouldn't see it. And that's what I mean by hidden. This is also going to disappear from the site contents so that we would have to know that existed to be able to go in and find it. So you'd have to know this address. Let me just move that I'm answering so you can see what I mean. So we'd have to remove, we have to know this address to find the library. That's what I mean by it's hidden. So it goes into that secret library. Okay. If you don't want it to go into that secret library to be retained, that's when you switch off allowing users to delete items, and then it will stay as an active document until it's recycled. Okay. Another question on licensing here, asking about external users. External users can't apply retention labels. So if they're putting content into a document library that has E5 level retention settings on it, that doesn't matter because they're not licensed users in your tenant. Okay, it's the licensed users that we need to worry about. Okay, so the E5 functionality will be maintained. And one last one. Assuming OneDrive is personal and you can't delete something from your personal folder, even if it's no longer relevant. Yeah, so if we've got retention settings, we've got retention policies applied to OneDrive or labels on content in the OneDrive, and we've got this off, then users will not be able to delete a document from their OneDrive. And yes, they might be personal documents, but they're in a business system, so the organization has control over those documents. Okay, if it's completely personal, then you shouldn't be putting it on a business. You shouldn't be storing it in the business OneDrive. Okay. How long is content in the Preservation Hold Library before it goes to the recycle bin? That is the retention period that we set, yes. So if I say this document we're going to retain for 7 years from the date it was created, and it's deleted when it's a year old, it will be in the Preservation Hold Library for a further 6 years until it is at the end of its retention period, and then it will go into the recycle bin. So if I just go back to that slide, this is what I mean here by this retention period. That's how long it's retained in the preservation hold library, and it depends how long you keep what you set that as. Okay, I think I'm up to date on all the questions. So moving on. Okay. If we talk about retention in Teams, we're talking about retention of messaging, or retention of files is exactly the same as for SharePoint, because those files are stored in the SharePoint site behind the team that powers the team, and therefore all of the file retention in Teams is exactly the same as I've described for SharePoint. When we talk about chat messages, these are actually stored for compliance reasons in your mailboxes. Okay, you don't see them. It's not possible to view them through a mailbox, but that is where they are stored. Okay. The mail system uses a similar hidden folder called the substrate holds folder. It does the same job as the preservation hold library. Okay, so the content, when it's deleted, if there's no retention on Teams chat at all or channel messages, then it goes into the substrate holds folder for 7 days, this route along the bottom here, and then it's permanently deleted. If the user does not delete a message, then it's held indefinitely. Okay, Teams messages are not automatically deleted after a particular period of time. Okay. If content is subject to retention settings, so if we say Teams chat messages cannot be deleted for a year, but after a year they can be, then if somebody tries to delete a message prior to that year, it will go into the substrate holds folder where it will stay, not just for 7 days, but until the end of the retention period, and then it will be permanently deleted. Okay. There are 2 questions in here that I will come back to. Okay. I have seen them, but I will come back to them. If we're talking about Exchange, this is exactly the same, but it applies to email and calendar items. Yeah. So when we set retention across Exchange, we're looking at email and calendar entries. And this again uses the same substrate holds folder, but we tend to refer to it as the recoverable items folder, because as a user we can see content we've deleted through the recoverable items interface. Okay, it doesn't show us your Teams messages because users don't see those. Okay, but if we delete an email, it goes into the recoverable items folder for a default of 14 days. Let's follow the route at the bottom. No retention. Sits in there for 14 days, and then we can recover it in those 14 days. If not, it's permanently deleted. If you set retention on an email, then it sits in recoverable items folder for however long you've set on the retention period, and then goes through that 14-day cleanup. Okay. Now, when you're setting up your retention, you have choices as to how you configure this. Okay, so let me just pull up these retention settings. Okay, now I will say this screenshot is slightly out of date. Microsoft have split this up into different segments as you walk through it now, a bit more of a walkthrough wizard, but it does show all of the settings. So we have different retention periods that we can set, and we can trigger when those are coming from, either from when it was created, from when it was last modified, or if you have an E5 license, you can go from an event. So we've got a question here about, can you use different trigger dates for retentions? So yes, you can. And I will pull up the screen to show you the defaults, and then you can add event-driven retention if you've got an E5 license as well. So let me just pull that up. And if we go into data lifecycle management, and let's create a label actually. So when we create a label, we give it a name. Okay. And you spend a lot more time on this than I'm doing here because it's only a demo. Okay. And this is what I mean by split those up. Let me just make that bigger so you've got a chance of reading it. Okay. So we have a choice of retaining content forever or just enforcing actions after a specific period. So that doesn't stop people deleting it in the meantime, or you can just put a label on and then track the content. If I want to retain it for 7 years, then I can choose, say, 7 years from when it was created, when it was last modified, or when it was labeled. Those are the defaults. After that, I'm going into generating my own events. And when we generate an event, you create an event type. So I've got end of financial year, which is one that I've created. And then you label the content with the financial year end that you're picking up and create an actual entry in the event to pick up that end of financial year. Okay. You can create new event types to fit in with whatever you need. So a common one when we're talking about safeguarding for young people especially is the date of birth. Okay, so we go off the date of birth of the young person that we're referring to. So we create a date of birth event, and then the document is linked to the person whose date of birth triggers their retention, triggers the retention of the content, and we create an event entry about that person in the date of birth environment. So we've got that event-driven retention. As I say, event-driven retention is an E5 functionality. Or you can go from when they were labeled, for example. And then you can choose what happens at the end of the retention period. Now, start a disposition review is, as I say, an E5 only feature. We also have the ability now to put a different label on. So it may be, say, financial records we have to keep for 7 years without getting rid of them. But then we decide that we want to retain them for another 5 years unless they've already been deleted. So we put a different retention label on at the end, which allows the users to delete them, but then we'll automatically delete it after another 5 years from the application of the modified label. Yeah. Or you can say, actually, just deactivate the retention settings, and if the user wants to delete it, they can. So we've got all sorts of different ways of configuring this. Okay. Let me just have a quick look at the questions because we've got some new questions come in here. So if something is in the preservation hold library, but you need to refer to it on and off, can you still access it? No, Okay. We can find that content through eDiscovery. We can restore that content, but we can't just access it. So if you don't want your users to be able to delete things and for things to go into the preservation hold library, then you should block your users from deleting content in the meantime. Okay. This question, it's not exactly a question, but I agree with the sentiment. When we send Teams chat messages, they are stored in the mailbox of the recipient and the sender. Okay, if they're in different organizations, that means there are different retention policies in play. Almost certainly. You may even have different retention policies covering the same user, different users in the same organization. So it's important to be very clear when you're setting up retention, to communicate it with your users so they know how long content is retained for, but also to give very clear guidance when they're working across organizations. Okay. You can apply retention labels to folders in SharePoint, not just single documents or whole libraries. Yes, that is correct. Okay. So disposition reviews is how we produce evidence that content has been disposed of. Okay, this uses the Microsoft 365 audit log. So it stores in the audit log the fact that the document was reviewed prior to disposal, any comments that were generated in that, any extensions, actions, etc. Now, disposition review is part of E5, and the E5 licensing extends how long content is kept in the audit log for, but Microsoft do recommend that you export the audit log to preserve the evidence of that disposition review. Okay, and there are programmatic connections to do that and third-party products that offer that solution as well. So this is going back to the question that we had before about if something's in the preservation hold library, can you reference it? If you want to reference that content, for example, as the question says, to create statistics, then you do need to switch off the ability to allow users to delete content. Okay, so if you want full reference to the document, then you need to prevent your users deleting retained content, or declare that content as a record rather than a retention. The audit log does record that the content has been deleted, but it's not evidence of deletion. It's not considered evidence of disposition. Okay, so the audit log will record that content has been deleted, but it's, how do I explain this properly? It will show that X number of documents reach the end of their retention period and were removed from the preservation hold library, but it doesn't necessarily show us each individual document. So we can't track back to prove each individual document has been automatically deleted. Okay, it doesn't give us the granularity that we need without the disposition reviews. Okay. So If we've chosen, say, to delete items automatically, then we can go and create that retention label. Now, nowhere in there, if I just go back to what's happening during the retention period, nowhere in here am I controlling what happens during that period. So if I just cancel that and go instead to records management, which is the E5, the premium functionality, I create my labels in the file plan. And when I create a label here, and I'm conscious of time, so not being quite as descriptive as I was even before, please be more precise than I was. Okay, so when you create a file plan, you have the ability to put descriptors in this. This is more from a Microsoft 365 perspective of helping you sort and filter these labels. It doesn't really do it doesn't have an impact on the retention. Okay, it's more for organizing your labels. We can choose what we want to do, again, how long we're going to keep things for. Okay, so we say we're going to keep them for 7 years, but then because this is a record label, this is where we have choices as to what happens to the content in that retention period. So this goes to a lot of the questions you've been asking. Okay, we don't have that control in the retention functionality, but we do have this control in the records labels. Okay. And as far as how a user accesses these labels, whether it's a retention label or a record label, it's exactly the same. Okay. And in terms of making sure picking up what happens after the retention period, if we start a disposition review, then depending on who that's assigned to, we can have a business process to make that quite speedy. Yeah, these documents are all assigned the dispose with evidence label. So we just go and dispose of them, and then we've got the record from a disposition review perspective. And then the people who are carrying out those reviews understand that they are basically there just to click the button to say, yes, get rid of it. So we get that full audit. Okay. If we want to look at those documents much more closely, then you'd create a label with a different kind of disposition review. You'd ask people to look at them in more detail. You'd assign different users to the retention, to the disposition review, to actually review whether content needs to be to actually be reviewed. Okay. Now, it's only when we come to this records management piece that we need the E5 license. If we want to do retention without an E5 license, then what we can do is we can go to the data lifecycle management options with an E3 or even a business premium license. You can create a retention policy that sets a default for different users or different SharePoint sites or teams. Okay. Choosing whether you're going to apply it, if you're on an E3 only, if you don't have E5, you don't have the type of scope choice. So I'll come back to that in a second. And then you can choose what locations it's applied to. I tend to recommend that you create the policy per location, so you have the full range of options available to you. I don't tend to mix and match. And then you can choose how long you're keeping the content for. And for Exchange, it's based on when it was created or last modified. Those are the only options I have. Not requiring an E5 license here. These are the standard options in here. Okay, so all of those options are available to us without an E5 license. We can also create retention labels, which are manually assigned to the content. Can't set them to automatically be assigned, but we can set them to be manually assigned. And again, as we go through, we've got these options here to retain or just enforce after a specific period. Okay, and again, we have the first three options. Those are default. It's only when we go to events that we need the E5. Okay. And then when you come to the end of your retention period, it's only the disposition review option that you don't have if you don't have an E5 license. You can change the label, you can deactivate, but you don't have the disposition review option. Okay. Or just deactivate the retention settings and let the users make their own choices. So those are those different retention settings when we looked at the licensing there as well. Please remember the settings here. These are part of the records management functionality. Okay, so we do have to pick those. We do have to have the E5 license to configure these settings, but it does mean you can block your users deleting things when you've got retention labels. Okay, a couple of questions that we can deal with quickly. One blanket policy for all sites. Yes, just SharePoint sites in your label, in your retention policy, and just leave it as all. Blanket policy. Same with mailboxes, same with Teams chats. Okay. So manually assigning retention labels. We set up a label, we publish it out to the particular location, and then the users apply the content through the metadata of the document. That is correct. You can also now do that from within Microsoft Teams. If my Teams will load, just give me a second. So here we go, Microsoft Teams. I go into a document, I click, let me zoom in, that I for information icon in the top corner there. And then I have all of the properties to set. Now I've pulled up on the fly to demo here a site that doesn't have retention labels published out to it. Oh, it does. Tell a lie. There we go. And I can apply those retention labels. Okay. So I can pick any of the labels that have been published to this particular SharePoint site. Okay. And pull those up. I have seen the questions in the chat and I will come back to them. There's just one thing I want to make sure we cover before we finish. With the retention and records management settings, I can have a number of different settings coming into effect. Each particular piece of content can only have one label assigned to it directly. That is an explicit piece of retention settings. But I might have a policy that covers it from the library. Someone might have set a default label for a folder that the document is in. So I could then easily have 3 sets of rules that are being applied to that one piece of content. So we have this principle of retention. So if from those 3 sets of rules, from the site, the folder, or the document itself, if one of those says retain the document and the others say to delete it, I follow the rules that say we retain it. If they all say we retain it for the same length of time, then the one that's assigned specifically to the piece of content is the rules that I follow. So this table is the ranking order, if you like. So we start off, if the rules are all the same, they all say retain, then we go and look at the next option. If they all retain it for the same period of time, then we need to go on to the next step. And here, if one is assigned to the document, that's the one that wins because it's explicit. If they were all inherited from the site or the folder, then whichever one got rid of it the quickest at the end of the retention period, because remember, the retention period is the same for us to get here, then that's when I get rid of it. So this principle of retention is really important to bear in mind when you're designing your retention structure and how you want to handle that. I'm going to come back and finish with the questions, but I do just want to first of all say, if you do want to go into this in any in more detail, the company that I'm working with, Leadership Through Data, do offer a series of courses, and you want to have a look at these records management courses here. Those are the ones that you want to have a look at to go into more detail, and those are multi-day courses. Now, obviously, we've only scratched the surface. So coming back to these questions, let's have a look at them. Assign disposition reviewers. Okay. Right. So here, a disposition reviewer can be given the ability to review the content without needing to have permission to access the site. So there is a disposition review permission, which is an admin level permission. So it gives them access to the documents once they come into the disposition review. Okay. Or you can not give them that admin level permission, and then they can only see content in the disposition review that they have access to. Okay, so only the sites that they would normally access will they see documents that have come up for review in that disposition review. Okay, so yes, you can do it that way. Based on the site permissions, that's the default, or you can assign an admin role so they can see everything. You don't apply a retention label to a library, you apply it to a folder within the library, and that is then inherited by the documents within, but that is not explicitly assigned to the document. So when we were talking about this principle of retention, it's not explicit, it's implicit because it's inherited from the folder. So we can't assign a retention label to a library. So we have a folder containing, for example, case files in a library. Okay, and the retention is applied to the files within that folder. Okay, depending on what the retention settings are, depends whether you can delete the whole folder or just the individual documents. Okay, but typically we can delete the individual, you can delete the whole folder as well as the individual documents. I think I've covered all of the questions. There are some I haven't marked as answered, but I think we've covered all of them. So all remains for me to say is obviously thank you all very much. Hopefully that was helpful to you. I know I haven't gone into all of the detail because you can't cover a 2-3 day training course in an hour, but hopefully we've given you a flavor and pointed out some of the features and some of the pitfalls as well.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for an insightful session. I think that was great. Drummed up lots of questions. If anyone else has any questions that they'd like myself or Sarah to answer, you can see Sarah's information on the screen, but you can also contact me at legal@irms.org.uk. As I said, registration will be open shortly for the next session in October. You'll see that announced on social media as well as the RMS's website under the events section. Thank you all for attending today's session, and I hope you have a lovely rest of the day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.